You can run on for a long time, run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Sooner or later, God'll cut you down. Sooner or later, God'll cut you down. Go and tell that long-tongued liar. Go and tell that midnight rider. Tell the rambler, the gambler, the backbiter. Tell him that God's gonna cut him down. Tell him that God's gonna cut him down. Tell him that God's gonna cut him down.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome each and every one of you, whether you're out in Harrison County or here in Ocean Springs. I'm really glad that you are here for the fourth and the final week of a series called The Dark Ages. If you've been around, then you know that this has not really been that feel-good, fun, family-friendly summer series that you often experience in church. But I would say that this series has been a really important and even a necessary series, especially when you consider all of the moral confusion and moral chaos that you see in our world today. In so many ways, I look at our world today and it reminds me of like a UFC bout or a big MMA match where you're rolling up into the octagon and there are very few rules and almost anything goes. Like that seems to me how so many people are living their lives today. And yet Paul is writing and he is saying that is not the way that God intended for it to be. In this section of Paul's letter to the Romans, he has addressed very sensitive sin issues. In this section of his letter to the Romans, he has addressed the reality of God's wrath, and he's even talked about the reality of a kind of darkness that has taken root both in our world and even in our own hearts. But today, as we wrap up this feel-good, friendly, fun, loving series, Paul's going to tell us one more thing, and the picture gets even darker. In fact, what Paul's going to teach us today is that the darkness is spreading, and it seems like there is no stopping it. I don't know if that's the way you feel, but that's what Paul was seeing in his world, and I think it's probably what a lot of us feel like we see in our world today. Let me just ask you, how many of you know what this plant is? We're going to throw a picture up on the side screen. Anybody know what that plant is? Kudzu, yeah, man. Growing up in East Tennessee, that's not me. People ask, is that you? That's not me, okay? I would never wear a hat that looked like that. But listen, growing up in East Tennessee, I would see hillsides just like that everywhere I went, man. Kudzu seemed like it was growing everywhere. If you know kudzu, then you might know that it's known by a couple of different names. In addition to kudzu, it's also known as a mile a minute and the vine that ate the South. According to the Nature Conservancy, this vine is native to both Japan and Southeast China. It was first introduced into the United States toward the end of the 19th century. Initially, people introduced it in America because they thought this is a beautiful, great, ornamental type plant. It has a sweet smelling bloom and really strong, sturdy vines. Then in the middle of the 20th century, the Soil Conservation Service, they started planting kudzu everywhere in abundance because they believed that it would be a great tool to fight against erosion. Little did they know that kudzu was and is a killer. When they planted kudzu in abundance, they had no idea that this viney-like plant, it grows over and it takes over anything and everything in its path. In fact, once kudzu is established in an area, it grows at an estimated 1 foot per day. And so, yes, it's known as the vine that ate the South, but you need to know that it has made its way out of the South. It's all the way up in the Northeast. It's made its way into the Midwest, and it is now even taking over areas of Oregon. It is out of control. And in so many ways, it is just like the sin that is so rampant in our world today. Sin, too, is out of control. I just want you to think about some of the parallels between kudzu and sin for a minute, okay? But both are spreading, and it seems like there is no stopping it. Both entangle anything and everything that it comes in contact with. In fact, the author of Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, talks about the fact that if you are going to play around with sin, then you need to be prepared for the fact that sin will inevitably entangle you. But both of these things, kudzu and sin, they're really difficult to eradicate once they take root, and both take time, but eventually they will destroy and they will kill anything they consume. In fact, here's the real problem. Sin is not just out there. The truth is, sin has even creeped its way in here into the local church. And if the church is really not all that different than the world, what do you think is going to happen to this world? If Christians who live all along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, if they get entangled in sin and engulfed in sin, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen to this community? What do you think is going to happen to your family? What do you think is going to happen to your kids and your grandkids? See, Paul's writing about this dark reality that is making its way all over the world and taking root in our lives. And what he teaches us is that if the church isn't different than the world, if Christians act like non-Christians, then inevitably we are looking into a world that will feel like we are living in the dark ages. That is the world that your kids and your grandkids will grow up in, and that is the problem that Paul is addressing today. I want to jump in. Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to 16 is where we're going to get started. This is what Paul wrote. He said, "All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares." If you go back to the top of this passage and you look at the beginning of verse 12, you're going to see two very important phrases. In fact, if you're using your Romans Bible journal, I want you to underline the phrase, "all who sin apart from the law." And then I want you to underline the other phrase, "all who sin who are under the law." Notice, there are only two groups of people in the world. There are those who don't have the law of God, and they sin. And then there are those who do have the laws of God, and they also sin. Paul's point is very simple. Everybody sins. There is no third category of people in the world who do not sin, and that poses a real problem. But because if sin takes over God's people, then there's no one left in the world to fight against the sin that is destroying the world. And so Paul is warning us. He's saying, man, if sin consumes the rebels and the religious, if sin consumes those who never go to church and those of you who always go to church, if sin consumes those who have never even heard of the law, and it consumes those who have memorized the law, then we are in trouble. Our communities are in trouble. Our families are in trouble. Our kids and our grandkids are in trouble because there will be no moral conscience in society, and people will start acting like animals. In fact, in so many ways, it's already happening. If you think about the fact that Paul is writing this letter to the Romans, it's really important to note that a lot of people believe that this is the very thing that led to the fall of the Roman Empire and eventually straight into the Dark Ages. That they were living in mass moral confusion that eventually produced total chaos. I mean, if you think about something as powerful as Rome and you think, how in the world could such an powerful civilization come crumbling down? It's because they weren't defeated by an external enemy, that they were defeated by themselves, that they so got caught up in sin and rebellion against God and gratifying the flesh that it led to their downfall. And let me tell you something, if we can see how it led to Rome's downfall, isn't it pretty easy to see how the same exact thing can lead to the downfall of America as well? In verses 13 to 16, Paul is talking about those who don't know the law, okay? That these are people who didn't grow up in church, that these are people in his culture who probably never even heard of Moses, that they've never heard or read the Ten Commandments. And so a lot of people might hear that and they might think, well, you can't really expect people like that to live according to any real moral standard, that they just don't know God, that they don't know the law. Paul says that's not entirely true. And so if you grew up and you never really went to church, maybe this is your first time in church, you never had a Bible, never read a Bible, your parents weren't Christians, you're not a Christian, it might be easy for you to think God's going to give me a pass. That's not entirely true. When you look at their lives, what you see is something that is very, very interesting. Even though they don't have the law, there are times when they keep the law. Now the question is, how is that possible? It's only possible because of the way God created people. God created all people with a moral compass so that we might know the difference between right and wrong. Look at verse 15. He said, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times even defending them. And so you know what Paul's saying? He's saying that every person on the planet has a heart that tells them right from wrong. Every person on the planet has a conscience that tells them right from wrong. Every person who has ever lived, they have thoughts that tell them right from wrong. And so Paul is basically saying, listen, man, I know you don't have the scrolls or the stone tablets, but that doesn't mean you have an excuse because of the way in which God has created you, the way in which He has wired you, you know right from wrong. In fact, be honest with me. If this is your first time in church, or maybe you're kind of new to church, you don't have to raise your hand. But haven't there been moments in your life when you kind of felt like you had a check in your gut about something you were about to do? Haven't there been moments in your life when you had a thought go through your head that said, dude, you shouldn't do this. This is not right. This is wrong. Of course you have. And because of that, Paul says there is no excuse for people who disobey God. We don't get a free pass because our parents weren't Christians. We don't get a free pass because we didn't grow up in church. We don't get a free pass because we don't have a Bible. Ignorance of the law is no excuse because God has wired you to know right from wrong. In some ways, you're kind of like a smart home. I'm curious. Anybody got a smart home? Let me see your hands. Anybody have a smart? 3 people have a smart home, and you probably all live together. He has a semi-smart home, and so it's kind of a dumb home. kind of a smart home. I don't have a smart home, but if you have a smart home, then what that means is that your home has certain abilities because of the way that it has been wired. And so you can be out at work, you can be running errands, you can be on a vacation in another country, and yet your home will do exactly what you want it to do because it has been wired up to obey your commands. And so just by using your phone and an internet connection, you can turn on the lights in your home from church. You can crank up or turn down the thermostat. You can open or close the garage door. You can lock or unlock the front door. You can turn on the coffee pot, the crock pot. You can heat up the hot tub. You can close the blinds if you want. I mean, you can do all of these things because of the way that your home has been wired or designed. And the same is true of you and me and every person who's ever lived on the planet. Doesn't matter if you grew up in a Christian country like America or if you grew up on an island and never had a Bible. You have the capability to obey God because that is the way in which God wired you. That there is something inside of you that instinctively knows right from wrong. There's something inside of you that knows when you're living a life that is pleasing to God, and that there is something inside of you that knows when you are getting ready to rebel against God because you feel it. Pastor Andy Stanley often tells people, do not ignore that feeling. I love how he says it. He says, pay attention to the tension. If something bothers you, let it bother you. Let it bother you until that tension is resolved or until you decide not to do it. He knows that the tension we feel is the conscience that God has put inside of us. It's that check in your gut. It's that thought that runs through your head. In fact, Paul said that sometimes you have thoughts that accuse you, and other times you have thoughts that defend you, but because you're doing the right thing. And that's true. That's true of people who have never read this book, and it's true of people who have never been in church. But it is also true of people who have read this book, and it is especially true of people who have grown up in church. Remember, kudzu did not just eat the South. It is invading the entire country. Sin is not just affecting people out there. Sin is sadly affecting those of us in here. And that is why the rest of these verses are so important. I know some of you, man, you're new to church. You're back in church for the first time in a really long time. But I know that most of you are in church all the time. And so these verses, that they speak to us, but because sadly, those of us who are in church, we wrestle with sin and selfishness just as much as people who are never in church. Do you realize how devastating that can be to your life, your family, and the world around you? Jesus did. In fact, Jesus talked about it in Matthew 5:13-16. Jesus is talking only to his followers. And this is what he said to them. He said, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Jesus knows that if his followers lose their distinct flavor, the thing about them that makes them different from everyone else in the world, then they will not just lose their flavor, that they will lose their ability to preserve a world that is rotting away. This is Jesus' way of saying that his people, that the church that he's going to create, it will no longer be good for anything at All because the church will no longer accomplish what he always intended for it to accomplish. I need you to think about that. If our light grows dim, our world grows darker. That's the problem that Paul is going to address through the rest of the chapter. Look at verses 17 to 24. He says, now you, if you call yourself a Jew, and I just need to take a time out because you don't call yourself a Jew, okay? Most of you would never call yourself a Jew. But in his context, he's saying the Jews were the religious people. They weren't the rebels. And so he's talking to the religious people. And this is what he says. He says, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you were instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. You know what he's saying? He's saying these people, they don't practice what they preach. That they say all the right things, but they don't do the right things. They say they know God's will and that their lives are being instructed by the law. They say that they're a guide to the blind and that they are a light to those people who are living in darkness. They say they teach little children, and they do teach little children. But then Paul says the problem is that you don't even bother to teach yourself. They preach against stealing, but then they steal. They tell everybody else, don't commit adultery. But then secretly they're running around and they're committing adultery. That they're always talking about the law because they want everyone to be impressed by how much they know the law. But then they don't even bother to keep the law. And because of that, Paul says that God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Do you remember what Jesus just said a few minutes ago in Matthew chapter 5? He's talking to his people, and he said that if you do your job and you live as the light of this world, that God is glorified because of you. And now, Paul is circling around to the opposite side of that same coin, and he says, if you don't do your job as a follower of Christ, and you live like the rest of the world lives, and you get caught up in sin and entangled in sin and engulfed in sin, then God's name is not glorified because of you. God's name is blasphemed because of you. You need to know this. If you call yourself a Christian, you are influencing people whether you realize it or not. You are either leading people to God or you are driving people far away from God. When our words don't match our deeds, we are hypocrites. And in case you didn't know, nobody likes a hypocrite. Jesus loved everybody. And even Jesus did not like hypocrites. Listen to what he said to a church in Revelation chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. He said, I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. That these people, man, they said one thing, that they did another thing, that they weren't really on fire for Christ, but they weren't really ice cold or opposed to Christ either. They were just kind of lukewarm about Jesus, and Jesus could not stand it. And so he was about to spit him out of his mouth. Charles Spurgeon once said this. He said, of all the things in the world that stink in the nostrils of men, hypocrisy is the worst. Paul says that our hypocrisy as followers of Jesus, it doesn't just say something about us. Paul's greater concern is that our hypocrisy says a lot about God. And so let me ask you, if people looked at your life, what would they say about your God? Would it make them want to know your God and follow your God? Or would it make them want nothing to do with your God? Because if our faith is a joke, then our God inevitably becomes a joke. Or let me ask it like this. Are you a hypocrite? When you walk into Mosaic, does your language all of a sudden start to change? When you walk into Mosaic, does the way you treat your wife and your kids start to change? You act so nice and so kind and so loving, but you're a complete jerk when you get back in the car or back to the house. Does the way you worship God and feel about God and love God, does it change when you walk up in here? Or are you the exact same person in here that you are out there? Listen to me. When I hire staff, I tell them, who we are on this stage is the same person that we are when we get off this stage. We will always portray ourselves in public in the exact same manner that we portray ourselves in private. And I tell them, if that's not who you are, if you play the Christian game and you act one way when you're around your buddies in the office and another way when you're on stage or in spiritual leadership, you will not make it on this staff team. It will not happen. Are we perfect? No, we're nowhere close to perfect. But when we sin in this church, we grieve over that sin, we confess that sin, we ask God to change our lives so that we do not continue in that sin. And when you start to get there, what you begin to realize is that what Paul's talking about is not even really a behavior issue as much as it is a heart issue. How do you feel about it when your words don't match up to your deeds? How do you feel about it when sin entangles you and engulfs you? Do you want to get out of it, or do you want to get all you can out of it? There's a big difference. How you feel about your sin is more important than you understand. Look at these last set of verses in Romans 2:25-29. He says, circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code in circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. Now, I know that Paul's discussion about circumcision seems like a strange analogy. That's because it is a really strange analogy, right? Can we just all agree on that? Nobody came to church today going, boy, I hope Pastor Brandon talks about circumcision, right? If you came to church thinking that, you're going to need to find a new church because you make me very uncomfortable, okay? Now, in all seriousness, there is an historical context that will help this whole discussion about circumcision make a lot more sense. In the Old Testament, God told the men of Israel, His chosen nation, that they needed to be circumcised. There was probably a health benefit to it, but there was something more behind it than that. See, circumcision for the Jews was an outward expression of an internal faith that they had in God. And so watch this. If God told them to do something, their faith in God always led them to do it, even if it was something extreme like circumcision. And so think about it like this. If God can convince a man to do that, then that man is going to do anything that God wants him to do, right? Like God has that man because that man is completely and totally committed to God. No matter what you ask me to do, God, I'm going to obey. Now, Paul is drawing on this aspect of their lives to say it's not just about how things look on the outside. What's even more important than the outside is what's going on the inside. What's going on in your heart. That's why Paul talked about in that passage the circumcision of the heart. We all sin, and so on the outside, we all look the same, but on the inside, we are not all the same. The difference is about how we feel toward that sin on the inside. John MacArthur once wrote this. He said, in many ways, the attitude of obedience is much more vital than the act. Because if the attitude is right, the act will naturally follow. But the right action with the wrong attitude is nothing but hypocrisy. And so I just want to lead you into a time where I'm going to ask you to reflect, not on your actions, but on your attitude. Because the truth is, there are going to be days when your actions are wrong. There are a lot of days when my actions are wrong. But if your attitude is right, your actions will eventually be right. If your attitude towards sin is one that leads you to grieve and to confess and to apologize and to pray for help that God would somehow change you, then that attitude will eventually correct your actions. That's why God is far more concerned with what's going on the inside of you than He is with what's going on the outside of you. In fact, this is why God commends to us a man whose name was David, and he talks about how David was a man who was always after God's own heart. Did David have sins? Oh, you better believe he had sins. Did David have secrets? You better believe he had secrets. But he also had a heart, and his heart longed to please God in everything that he said and did. If you don't know the story, David was a powerful king. And as a powerful king, he could have anything and everything that he wanted, any time that he wanted it. And so one night, all of his troops were off at war, and he decided to hang out at the house. He stepped out onto his balcony. He was looking out over his kingdom, and do you know what he saw? He saw a woman who was taking a bath, the backside of her house. And he decided that he wanted her. Instead of resisting the temptation, he gave in to the temptation. And so he told one of his servants to go get her. She came to meet with him, and he discovered that this is actually Uriah's wife. And so it's not just another woman, it's another man's wife. And yet he slept with her anyway. If you know the story, then you know that he didn't just sleep with her, but that she became pregnant. And that was a real problem because Uriah wasn't at home where he could have gotten his wife pregnant. Instead, Uriah, her husband, was off at war fighting to defend David and David's kingdom while David was sleeping with Uriah's wife. And so if Uriah came home in a few months from battle, and a baby comes popping out a few weeks later, Uriah's going to know that baby isn't mine. They didn't have the fertility test like Jerry Springer, but they knew, right? Like he would have known that that's not my kid. And so long story short, David knew that he was in trouble. And so David sent Uriah into the fiercest part of the battle. And then he withdrew the troops to ensure that Uriah would die in war. David had a lot of sins. And David had a lot of secrets, but God knew his secret. And so God sent Nathan, the prophet, to confront David about what he had done. And when David was confronted about what he did, do you know what he did? He didn't defend himself. He didn't kill Nathan in the moment. Instead, he broke down because he wasn't just sorry that he got caught. He was genuinely sorry for what he did. His actions were not right, but his heart was right. In fact, listen to what David wrote in Psalm 139, verses 23 and 24. David prayed to God and he said, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting." As we wrap up this series called The Dark Ages, I want to be realistic about sin. I know that we don't always do what is right, but is your heart right? And so I want us to all bow our heads and I want to move into a time of prayer together. And I really want this time to be a time where David's prayer becomes your prayer. Right now, right where you sit, I just want you to invite God to search your heart. I want you to say, "God, look at my heart. I want you to test me and I want you to know my anxious thoughts." Give God the freedom to do an examination of your life to see if there is any offensive way that lives inside of you. As God starts to highlight some of those offensive things, right where you sit, I just want you to say, "God, I want you to forgive me for that. I don't just want you to forgive me, I want you to change me." Ask God to lead you like David did. "God, I want you to lead me in the way everlasting." Your actions may not be right, but when your heart is right, your actions will inevitably follow. For those of you who are sitting there and you are deeply concerned about your sin and your secrets, maybe you haven't grown up in church, you didn't have Christian parents, you've never read the Bible, and you're sitting here thinking, "Uh-oh, I'm going to be accountable even though I didn't know?" Yes. But I want to remind you of what Paul wrote earlier in the chapter. He said that yes, our secrets will be judged, but our secrets will be judged through Jesus Christ. You know what that means? That means that if you have Jesus, you have forgiveness. But if you do not have Jesus, then you are accountable for every single secret you keep. And so if you've never admitted your need for Jesus, you can do that right where you sit. Say, "God, I need Jesus to forgive my sins. I'm trusting in Jesus to make me right with you. Trusting Jesus to start leading my life so that my life might truly be different." God, we all struggle with sin. And I pray, God, that for those who don't know Jesus, I pray that they would find Him today. And God, for those who do know Jesus, for your church, for people who call on the name of Jesus Christ, and they're known in this community as a Christian person, I just pray, God, that you might wake us up to the serious nature of sin. Pray, God, that we would have a right attitude towards sin and that eventually we would have a right lifestyle that says no to sin. And so, God, would you please use this message to change your people and to make your people the salt of the earth and the light of the world that you always intended for us to be. God, would we take that light into the world around us that is often very dark? God, will we shed that light and share that light with people so that they might come to know you and so that our good deeds might bring glory to you and might encourage them to live a life that is completely different. And so, God, help us to navigate this. I pray, God, that you would change us and ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.